policy wonks about blood pressure. The other thing they mentioned is that the way of taking blood pressures that we typically do with the pressure gauges or mercury is not adequate enough. There's too much bias. That using the electronic methods is what most people are recommending, 2 readings on an electronic method, because there's an independent, unbiased way of reading that. And what they found, and this is kind of a recurrent theme, is home blood pressure monitoring with a reliable home blood pressure cuff is very reliable. It's actually a very good gauge. So that's kind of like the background of how crappy we're doing, basically, in managing blood pressure, and that's that Pavlov et al. The other one that I looked at was one that says too much of a good thing, and this talks about the ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, like Olsan Group has. And it was interesting to read that because it was more of a review of ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. And clearly, the authors are not big fans of ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. But they made a good case. They actually went back to several of the studies that made cases that ambulatory blood pressure monitoring is good, and they really teased them apart. And what they found was that ambulatory blood pressure monitoring was only good if you have only 1 or 2 blood pressure readings by standard clinical ways. So, you or I check it in the office. The more blood pressure readings that they looked at, so if a doc had 8 or 10 or 18 blood pressure readings over the course of the year, the variation compared to ambulatory blood pressure monitoring was essentially no different. So if your office monitoring is actually pretty good, the more readings you have. When they looked at blood pressure, ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, they found that the only time that it wasn't as good as clinical blood pressure monitoring was when there wasn't as much variation in your office readings. So when they looked at ambulatory blood pressure monitoring as a whole, they said, overall, statistically, ambulatory blood pressure monitoring was better at getting an accurate reading what the blood pressure truly is, except if the correlation coefficient was greater than 50%. So 50% of the time your readings were within 50% of one another, it was just as good as ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. So if it dropped below that, in other words, there was this huge, if they saw these, the general rule was if there was, the more variation there was in your clinical blood pressure monitoring. So you did 120 over 80 one day, and then it was 160 over 100 another day. Then ambulatory blood pressure monitoring was more useful, or was more accurate. If you had pretty in sync blood pressure readings from office reading to office reading, you didn't get much out of ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. The other thing they found that was that the outcomes comparing ambulatory blood pressure monitoring and clinical blood pressure monitoring were very weak. So in other words, there wasn't any evidence that ambulatory blood pressure monitoring was any better at controlling blood pressure and reducing outcomes in terms of better blood pressure control or cardiovascular outcomes than clinical blood pressure monitoring, which I thought was very interesting. And the reproducibility of ambulatory blood pressure monitoring was horrible. So they looked at people like Olsan Group have had their own system for doing it, and about a third in the general population had good systems and good reproducibility and good quality. Only in the best systems, only about 2/3 had fair to good quality. So there's a lot of variability even in those organizations that make a buck off this stuff. The other thing that they had said was,
I didn't get the point about control.
so in other words, the general rule of what they were saying was, the more blood pressure readings that you had, the less useful ambulatory blood pressure monitoring was.
And the more consistent they were.
And the more consistent they were, the less useful it was.
You didn't get the part I think Lou
The
said
outcomes.
that the outcomes weren't any different when you used ambulatory monitoring to be more accurate.
Right.
There was no evidence of any
In other words,
better outcomes.
any additional control that you got didn't really relate to any better outcomes, which was interesting.
You mean the outcome of just achieving the understanding of what their average blood pressure was?
You mean outcomes?
Outcomes not
Heart
only in
attack,
control
stroke.
and outcomes in terms of cardiovascular outcomes.
Okay.
So it wasn't any more effective.
Right. So that intervention. So let's say you decided to use for your patients only ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. You get
Right.
Olsan to slap it on, and that's the way you're going to assess if they're controlled.
Okay.
versus you just having them come in the office every 3 months.
Okay.
There may be some data to show that you'll get better control with ambulatory blood pressure monitoring if there's wide variations in your readings, okay?
Mhm.
But even in those patient populations, those that did use ambulatory blood pressure monitoring versus your clinical, blood pressure monitoring in the office and instituting therapy, the outcomes were no different.
Okay.
They're the same number of heart attacks,
And
same number of strokes. It was a washout. There's a lot of fancy technology that may have improved the numbers, but somehow it didn't translate into an outcome. And granted, they say that there may be a longer follow-up that was needed, but they were kind of shocked that in some of the studies that you see, like the one that just came out in the elderly, which was a relatively short-term study where they showed such a dramatic improvement in getting the systolic blood pressure to 150, they didn't see anything like that. So they're saying there seems to be a lot of hype for ambulatory blood pressure monitoring that isn't really warranted.
Okay.
The instances they said that it's probably useful is if you have patients that have these wide, which makes sense based on what they're saying, these huge variations. One day they're 110/70, another time they're 170/80. Those are patients that it may be very useful for. And interestingly, they said that when you compare ambulatory blood pressure monitoring and its expense and compare it to home blood pressure monitoring, you get the same benefit. And actually, home blood pressure monitoring may have better outcomes. So it's a much cheaper way of looking at it. So that's looking at it from just how we monitor it. My take home from that is there's not a lot of really impressive information for ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. It's probably a great financial boon for somebody like Myron, but
And proof that the insurance companies should gladly pay for home blood pressure cuffs as opposed
Yeah.
to
Exactly.
ambulatory blood pressure
Exactly. That's a
monitoring.
good point.
Exactly,
That's a very
exactly.
good point.
Well, as an aside, I had one patient who had widely varying blood pressures, and we did that ambulatory thing, and it found that he was having these nocturnal spikes that were quite high. And actually, we changed management, and they went away.
That
So
is
it
one.
did
That's
work.
glad you reminded. There was one thing I
It's
did
the only
leave out
person
of
who's
that.
ever had it done in my practice.
It's interesting because that was the one place where the outcomes were different for ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, were patients who had high nocturnal readings,
Nocturnal ones, right.
which was a very small number. They said it's difficult to really assign a lot of statistical significance to it. But it was the one thing when they teased it out that was the one pearl from ambulatory blood pressure monitoring that may have improved outcomes is those nocturnal spikes,
Nocturnal
which is
spikes.
interesting to mention that.
And that came through in JNC7, they commented on that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That was their only take for doing ambulatory.
So you're
But why
supposed
would
to
you,
have,
How would you
and the
know?
point
have your
was, why
patients
would
wake
you-
up.
why would you
This
use
guy
it?
is so neurotic, he would wake up at 3 in the morning
Why
and
would you
check
have
his blood
patients
pressure.
that do that?
And it would be high.
The other articles that are in there is one that has that's titled it's from the Annals of Internal Medicine, Care et al. KER et al. It's from 2008. And that was actually a very interesting article. It's actually just this March or something like that. And this was very interesting. I give these guys a lot of credit. They actually, it's a VA-based study, so it's take it with a grain of salt. But basically what they did was they decided to do a study of a huge population of patients and providers looking at reasons that blood pressure is not controlled in doc's office, looking provider specific. And they assigned 4 reasons. Uncertainty, meaning do they really have high blood pressure? Whether there's competing demands or priorities, something else going on with the patient, medical issues, how many medicines, the complexity of medicines, and just organization, financial incentives and the workings of the office and time with patients. It's a very complicated model they had, but the upshot of it was when they looked at these individuals, all these patients a year later, only about 50% of them had a med change, even though they were all hypertensive or newly diagnosed hypertensive. They had a med change or a med institution, even though they had hypertension on 2 separate readings. The reason they found that there was no med change, the thing that they found that was significant were they found it was more likely for MDs that had no med change. They were less likely to have a med change if the doc had a higher threshold for blood pressure. So there were docs who say, I believe 130/80, and that's what it should be. So naturally, they're more likely to make a med change. The patient's report from their home blood pressure was normal, was more likely not to result in a med change, which makes sense. And this kind of builds on that theme that the home blood pressure is very reliable.